Our practice is to give the same sermon at 8 and 9:30. I'll be in 13 churches this summer by the end of September. And I was told in Danbury that they didn't want a real sermon at 8 o'clock. So they don't have this practice. But one of the reactions after the 8 o'clock presentation of the sermon was someone said, "I wish we could raise our hand and stop you because we have questions." And I think that would be marvelous. I don't recommend doing it since we haven't talked about that. But the whole reason for preaching is to provoke conversation. And so a lot of what I try and say is to give us something to think about, chew on, and talk about. And I think we got to the point where the congregation and the preacher could interact. That would be a win for many. In the meantime, come to adult ed things, because for those who do that, I see at least 3 suspects over there and 1 or 2 over there. I do get derailed easily. When I was in seminary, when Moses was a young boy, I learned of the scandal of particularity. This gospel represents the scandal of particularity. The scandal says that is the doctrine that the only path to salvation is Christianity. That means that if you are not baptized, you are going to hell. Doesn't matter how good your life is. You can be a good Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, or whatever, you're going to hell. Of course, that gave the Catholic Church problems, so they invented limbo as a place for babies who die before they were baptized to go. But the rest of the world said that very clearly. The question is that what John intended in this morning's gospel when he wrote the text? Was the scandal of particularity, Jesus is the only path to God, a live question in the first century, or have we imposed that question upon the text as an aspect of Christian triumphalism? Lest you imagine that this is no longer a relevant question, since many of us are so accepting of other religions. I mean, Barbara and I went out to Seattle 4 or 5 years ago, where my niece, who was raised in the Episcopal Church, got married at a Buddhist temple. So many of us are accepting of other religions. Remember that in the last election, one of the issues was saying Happy Holidays rather than Merry Christmas. That somehow that was demeaning the suffering of Christ to say Happy Holidays. It won't surprise many of you to know that after that I have resolved only ever to say Happy Holidays. While it may not be true for you and me, the cultural wars we're suffering from center on the word Christianity. Does Christianity need to be protected? Some see Christianity as threatened. They don't realize that Christianity is the largest religion, whatever that means, in the world, and will continue to be so for some decades to come. If current projections hold, Muslims will have a higher birth rate annually than Christians in 2035. So we've got, 17 years. Christianity is thriving in the southern hemisphere. Not doing so well up here, thriving down there. And it's thriving because the message of Christ makes a lot of sense to people in the southern hemisphere. It talks about somebody coming caring for you when you're poor, when you're persecuted, when you're sick or in prison. That's what Christianity talks about. When you look at the India and Pakistan, Christians by and large are darker than non-Christians because Christianity had something to say to those who felt oppressed by the reigning religion. Christianity does well with the disenfranchised. On the other hand, Islam is not triumphant in the United States. There's no great push for Islam converts in the United States. We're not threatened by them. It is not expanding in the southern hemisphere as rapidly as Christianity because it doesn't have a particular message to the poor. In this country, cynicism, hopelessness, disaffection, and secularism are triumphant. Some believe that restoring 50s Christian society is the answer. It isn't. We think of Christianity as a power in the world competing with other religions, principally Islam, for supremacy. But what was the world of the first century? We know from Paul's letters that in the first century, Christianity was such a small factor in the political life of the Roman Empire as to be insignificant. There are few secular references to the existence of Christianity. We weren't even important enough to be noticed as an annoyance. So I doubt John was asserting the scandal of particularity. Again, looking at Paul's letters, we believe that early Christianity appealed to women, particularly persecuted class, especially in that time, including wealthy women and powerless men. Fairly early in the life of the nascent church, Jews left. Early Christians were Gentiles, which is not a nice word, just a fancy word for pagan, by the end of the first century, and they were left with a gospel text that was rooted in a culture and place that they didn't understand, Judaism in Palestine. We know they didn't understand the geography because they frequently get it wrong. Jesus, from time to time, appears in a place he could not have gotten to between the previous verse and the next verse. He had to be able to teleport. Scotty was someplace. Beam me up. We also know that the title Christ given to Jesus makes no sense in a Jewish context. If your Jewish friends, we are still looking for the Messiah, they are. Jesus was not what they were looking for. The early church was, I maintain, attempting to assert itself as a credible religion in an indifferent world. I do not believe that John is asserting the scandal of particularity because that only became an issue after Constantine made Christianity official in the 4th century. While the evangelist John may have believed that Jesus was the only path to salvation, I doubt he intended to assert it here. The question that I believe John was addressing is one of relationship. Who is this Jesus? Is he a god or a demigod? Was he created sui generis? While Christianity was unknown in the first century, Judaism was not. It was admired by some because it was monotheistic in a polytheistic culture. I wonder if John wasn't attempting in this context to link Christianity with Judaism and portray Jesus not to Jews but to pagans as acting as one with the Jewish God, portrayed here as the Father. In other words, the gospel, rather than attempting to assert Christian superiority, is arguing for Christian relevance. Imagine the difference this would make in our world if we saw the need for us as Christians to attract others to our belief because it is relevant to their lives rather than because it is the only way to avoid hell. Now, we're Episcopalians, and we don't believe in talking about hell. And many of us, I used to love the old creed where you got to say hell. I thought that was just fantastic. And many of us may not believe that hell even exists, but it appears to me that our denomination and the church in the United States is tearing itself apart on issues that approach the doctrinal level of the scandal of particularity. Some are saying that we are only Christian if we accept ordination to any office for a qualified and duly elected or selected LGBTQ plus person. Others are saying we are only Christian if we affirm marriage is only possible between a man and a woman, and that intimacy outside of marriage is forbidden. These are irreconcilable positions. Does the gospel support this kind of clarity? Here Jesus says, through John, that the requirement of salvation is belief in him for those of us who are Christian, and acceptance that he is from the Father. He does not say that we must ascribe to any creed, behavior, or law. Simply, we must accept that we are called to be raised with him on the last day. Of course, when John wrote, there were no creeds and no New Testament. Constantine wanted creeds because he couldn't figure out what the Christians believed. They seemed to believe something different in every town. So they got together. It was very, very stressful. They left the Egyptians out. There was no New Testament. When John was writing, he had no idea that 2,000 years later, there would be people sitting in a church in Westport, Connecticut, of which he also could not have conceived, listening to what he said. Not there. He didn't realize he was writing for us. Our problems with our doctrines, including the scandal of particularity, are that they are based on preserving an institution, and it is at least arguable that Jesus never intended to establish an institution. Doctrines, especially creedal statements, became necessary only when Constantine recognized the church and made it official. Now, I'm in favor of the Episcopal Church. I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I'm glad to be covered by the church pension plan. I've been a priest for more than 41 years and served on the board of Virginia Seminary. I think it's important to know what we believe, and I have no difficulty saying and believing the Apostles' and Nicene creeds. But my background is in biblical studies, and I believe that we must refer our arguments to the Bible. When I do that, I find that the requirements for salvation are both simple and clear. For those of us who are Christians, salvation is dependent upon believing that Jesus was sent from the Father. This doesn't mean that I believe that there are no other paths to salvation. I do not believe the Bible addresses that issue. The Old Testament is clearly monolatrous. That's a word you don't hear often. You hear monotheism. Monotheism means there's only one God, and we say there's only one God, then we talk about the Trinity. You want to confuse people, just bring that one up. Monolatry means we only worship one God, so there's only one God for us. So throughout the Old Testament, there are lots of gods talked about, but the Jews are said, Yahweh is it for you, and the others are, powerless. So the possibility of other gods existing exists. In the New Testament, when Paul preaches in Areopagus in Athens on Mars Hill, he refers to the unknown God, which he identifies with God as revealed in Christ. He does not deny that other gods may exist. It is simply that there is one God for him. For me, I'm not arguing for the existence of other gods. I'm a monotheist. But God, for me, has revealed God's self through Christ, and that has implications. My hope for us is that rather than debating whether or not God has opinions on the political issues tearing us apart, that we unite in talking about the transformation being a Christian has made in our lives. I guarantee you that in the early church, John wrote to the people John wrote to consisted of people who joined the church because they wanted the lifestyle, the happiness, the sense of acceptance the members they knew had. Christianity grew, at least until Constantine, because it attracted people. The challenge in our ever-diminishing denomination is to figure out how to attract people. And the only way to do that is to offer them something they don't have and do need. The gospel this morning is one that offers people who feel lost hope. It says that if they respond to Jesus, then they meet the Father and they will be saved. Earlier in this same chapter, we have the feeding of the 5,000. Then Jesus walks on water. Earlier in John, he has healed, turned water into wine. And beginning this week and continuing next, talks about the Eucharist. The gospel says that people, whatever their condition, slave or free, male or female, rich or poor, will be saved through their belief in Jesus because he is a prophet like Moses. This means that the word he speaks is God's word. It doesn't mean he predicts the future. So I invite you, as you reflect on this gospel, the future of the Episcopal Church, to remember that faith is a gift. We have been called by the Father through Christ. The gift is not dependent upon our position on any issue, no matter how passionately we hold it. Our institutions may be dependent upon creeds and right belief, but our salvation is not. I don't know about you, but my salvation is more important than any institution, and the gospel assures me of that.